Hello and welcome to part 2 of our Federalism video series, connected here with Chapter 2. Today we're going to take a deeper look at federalism and the relationship between state and the federal government over time. Again, federalism, that relationship between state and federal government has changed gradually over time. We're going to start off talking about the old school version of how that relationship works. And when we say old school, we're talking about that relationship between the federal government and state governments more or less before we enter the 20th century. It begins to change at the time of the Civil War. And again, there's going to be some overlap, but generally we're talking about dual federalism. And we're talking about the relationship prior to the turn of the century, prior to the Great Depression, prior to World War II, the Cold War, etc. At this, or during this time period, we have the relationship is oftentimes called dual federalism. Dual federalism is when the national and state governments basically inhabit or reign supreme within their own spheres of influence. So there's a pretty definitive division between state and federal government. Now, the best metaphor to use when you're talking about old school federalism in the United States is called layer cake federalism. And layer cake federalism is exactly what it sounds like. All right, when you have a layer cake, all right, you have two distinct layers. And here's an example of a layer cake, something like you might get for your birthday, where you would have two distinct layers. For our discussion, we're talking about state governments and federal governments, and they're clearly divided between that or with that layer of icing. So up here you might have vanilla, and down here you might have chocolate, but there is a definitive division between their powers and their roles. And that's the way it's going to basically play out up until the Civil War, and you're beginning to see a definitive change. All right, and that's going to continue to change over time as we move forward. Now, this is generally considered an outdated version of the way that we view federalism. All right, today we have a much more contemporary view of the way federalism works, and that's called cooperative federalism. All right, and that cooperative federalism is when your national and state governments really are going to share a great deal of the policy making, and they're going to cooperate in solving problems that are going to face both the state and the federal government. Now, the metaphor for modern federalism is known as marble cake federalism. So instead of having a very defined chocolate and vanilla layer, we're going to have what they call marble cake federalism. And again, I'm drawing my picture of my birthday cake. And this is an example of the marble cake federalism. You can see here there's no definitive line in between, but we do have areas where there are chocolate and vanilla and they overlap, and there's no clear division. That's marble cake federalism. That's the federalism that we are still in the midst of today. Okay? There's always been a certain degree of crossover between the relationships between state and federal government. You could take that all the way back to the very beginning. But as we turn the century after the Civil War, we get into the Great Depression, begin seeing much more interaction or a much greater role of the federal government and supremacy, mainly with the role of money. All right. Factors in the expansion, the change toward this more cooperative version of federalism include the New Deal, the impact of the Great Depression, the Cold War, the emphasis on education and defense, and of course the expansion of social programs, and you could see that in the Great Society. All right, some of the details of the relationship between the state and federal government that we need to talk about is how that relationship works. And there are three main things that you need to keep in mind here. One is shared costs. Yes, the federal government foots the bill for many programs and is the big bank account for a lot of state programs. You know, we're talking about education, transportation. So there is federal money available, but in a lot of instances the state has to kick in some money also. A great example of that locally is going to be the Silver Line, where a big piece of that initial rail line was funded by the federal government through a grant, but another portion, or the rest of it, had to be figured out by local governments and paid for by those local municipalities. You also have federal guidelines. Again, any money that the federal government, or most money that the federal government is going to dole out to the states, is going to have what are called strings attached, which means the state's going to have to fulfill some requirements, jump through some hoops in order to get that money. All right, and then finally, shared administration. The federal government is going to give money for programs, but the federal government and the state governments are going to share the responsibility for managing them. So here is where you kind of get that definition of cooperative federalism. All right, today's federalism, again, we still exist in an age of cooperative federalism, but there have been movements over time that modify that relationship a little bit. And again, the one we talk about is new federalism. And that's been a conservative push to lessen the impact of the role of the federal government and give some power back to the states. And this has been done by our more conservative presidents, beginning with a small part when Nixon, but really expanded by Reagan. You'll see he's there in bold. And again, that's pushing more responsibility of controlling programs and controlling federal money back to the states, and with the idea that the states know how best to use their finances. This is also called devolution. And again, devolution is going to come up again in comparative government. It's where the power is going to be decentralized or pushed down to the subunits. If you want to have or look up a great example of how the federal government has used devolution effectively, you're going to look at welfare reform. Okay, in the early 90s, with the conservative Congress that came into power after the election of President Clinton, you could see that the big push was to try to give states more power, states' rights, to have some more control over local funding, and welfare reform is a great example. Another one was when the federal government actually eliminated the federal speed limit, which was 55, and allowed states to make their own decisions. And again, the big idea here is a protection of state power. All right, fiscal federalism, again, this is kind of the key to the state and federal relationship that we're going to be talking about, that you'll read about in your textbook. This is where the national government, it's their pattern of spending, the levels of taxation, and how they're going to spend their money or provide grants in order to influence both state and local governments. Okay, so really it is the power of the money that is provided through the federal government for state programs. Again, here in Fairfax County, we also rely on funding from the federal government for school lunch programs, etc., even though the county pays the bulk of the school bills here in Fairfax County. The national government is going to use fiscal policy to influence states by withholding or granting money in order to pay for specific programs. And they're going to use what are called grants in aid, and that's a generic term for money from the federal government to basically influence and aid state and local governments. All right, there's two types of categorical grants. We have categorical grants, again, is one of those types, and that's a grant with a very specific purpose. Sometimes they're going to require matching funds, again, that state or local kick-in. Sometimes they're awarded for very specific projects, and sometimes they're awarded on the basis of a competitive application or formula. All right, and those are all examples of categorical grants. We'll go into a little more detail here in the next slide. The thing you need to remember about a categorical grant is there always are strings or hoops attached. Okay, and the federal government can also add in other requirements like a crossover sanction, where money for one federal program is going to be used to influence a state or local decision on another. And the best example there is raising the drinking age to 21. They also can institute what are called cross-cutting requirements, and that's one condition in a particular grant. And the one that always comes up is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to influence all of the other activities supported by federal monies. So you can't discriminate. When you're using federal money in a program, you can't discriminate against anyone. Okay, there's two types of categorical grant, project and formula. A quick description on the last slide. Again, project grants are the most common. People are going to apply, local governments, individuals are going to apply for these kind of competitive grants. And again, a great example would be you're in a university, you're a professor, you're a scientist, you're a doctor, and you apply for a federal grant to research a specific problem. Formula grants are distributed based on a formula. Again, they're going to vary from grant to grant. They can be based on population. They can be based on income, graduation rates. We could go on and on and on, but they're based on a formula. These cause a lot of conflict because there's always a big discussion over those formulas and how they work out for the individual states. Again, we're talking about things like Medicaid, the amount of money the federal government's going to give states to help pay for their programs, how much money the federal government is going to kick in for public housing in a particular state, and also certain monies for community development like rec centers, athletic fields, etc. The other kind of grant, other than a block grant, or other than a categorical grant, is called a block grant. These are general grants that can be used for a variety of purposes. They're very broad, and these are very popular when we're talking about devolution or we're talking about new federalism. They have fewer strings attached, which means there's less hoops, and states are given a lot more control and power over how that money is used. All right, and finally here we have, when we talk about that federalism relationship, we have the idea of orders. The federal government can mandate or order states to do things. Again, a mandate is a requirement that is imposed by the national government on state and local governments, and you can kind of see how, states being ordered to do things may bring up or create some hard feelings. Okay, the best example, or one of the examples of one of those mandates, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we're going to take a peek at that with our federal panels activity that you guys are working on. These mandates are often going to require state and local governments to meet the requirement at their own expense, and again, that's called an unfunded mandate or an unfunded order. There have been attempts to try to limit the number of these orders to states to do certain things, but they have been moderately successful. Okay, there's a great snapshot at the next section of Chapter 3. Make sure you take some notes. You're going to be filling out or completing your federalism vocabulary after you finish watching this video. Thanks.